Yeah.
Yeah.
You pick your terrain and you take your choice. Whereas the road bike, you pick your terrain, but you can't take your choice. You know, if you see what I mean.
I
Yeah.
was actually just looking at the road bikes myself, and I got stuck at 2017, 2018 on the road bike choices because these were offering probably the aesthetically, engineeringly, and I have to give it to because my racing background, I like light bikes,
Mm.
and after that point, bikes just got fucked up heavy.
Yeah. I mean, the physics tells you that the weight doesn't really matter,
Yeah,
but it's more of a psychological thing. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Whatever. It's like as said, it's not fun to ride out on a bike, and if you're taking the bike out of the garage and it's heavy, it's
Mm.
just not that fun. You know, it's like starting sex. It's not that good of a entry point for that.
I'll have to remember that one.
Yeah, if you know, yeah.
Yeah. The only other thing I think is a bit useless for amateur cyclists is ceramic bearings.
Oh, I think you can get along, could do a long
The
monologue about
applica
that.
the application of ceramic bearings is not correct. Ceramic bearings are used for very high speed, very high temperature, and very high cleanliness environments, none of which relate to cycling.
Very high speed, you mean 30 kilometers per hour?
I mean, thousands of RPMs, which no parts of the bike reach. Yeah.
Oh,
I
why
think
not?
the highest RPM part on a bike is the lower jockey wheel, something like 500 RPM in 5311 at 100 RPM on the crank. I didn't just work that out in my head. I planned that.
Yeah, yeah. This is what I wanted to say. That it was like in Rayman,
No. Well,
89.
maybe I did work that out in my head, but I probably a bit wrong there. But it's roughly about 500 RPM at that gear ratio at that crank. Yeah.
And on the other hand, what's the most overlooked part of a bike that's left out of the equation for most of the people? What are people not spending that much
Uh,
money on?
I'm just gonna sound like I've gone on about this before. I'm just gonna sound boring and old fashioned, but
Yeah, welcome to the club,
what
mate.
most people overlook with cycling is what I call power endurance, and that comes back to comfort. So, if I could summarize it, basically, I would say most people overlook making the bike comfortable and making the bike set up in a way that you can do your like optimum power for a long time. So, there's no point having a bike where you can do a great 20-minute power test if you're a racing cyclist, but then after that, you literally can't bear to sit on the saddle, or you can't your hamstrings have gone and you've overexerted or you've overstretched or overreached or you get saddle sores after like 2 hours of riding. And I think most people overlook comfort in pursuit of like aerodynamics and lightweight and stuff like that. So I think, and that's driven by marketing as well. So marketing will push, aero and lightweight. But those two things are useless parameters if halfway through a 200-kilometer bike race you're fatigued and too sore to even sit on the saddle. So if you can, I don't know many people that can get to the end of I mean, obviously you have to be very fit to do a 200-kilometer bike race. Not every sofa surfer can do a 200-kilometer bike race, but even if you take very well-trained amateurs, I don't know many people who can say at the end of a 200K race that they can still smash the pedals and smile that they're comfortable and they're not fatigued. And I think that power endurance, or being able to do your power at the end of a very long bike ride, like 5-6 hours, is the most overlooked thing. And the marketing side of the industry is pushing, aero, high stiffness, low stack, long reach, and it sounds very fast, and it's like it's only like the human psyche, isn't it? It's like they want immediate satisfaction out of anything, whether it's a drink or like a phone. You want
The,
all the good shit. You want all the good shit like now,
the
now, now,
fast
now.
dopamine hit.
Yeah. But you don't. People most don't consider how they're going to feel on that bike at the end of like a 5-hour ride. And not many people ride 5 hours races day in, day out. I mean, if you do, you're probably a professional riding the tour or something. But I certainly think there's a lot of guys in the pro peloton that don't give that enough thought when you look at their bike fits. So this comes back to like comfort and bike fit. So I think that's probably the most overlooked thing.
I come up with pretty bad analogies from the American sports, and they say in the NFL that like the best ability is availability, and this goes in hand what you said, that if you get injured and it smashes up your back and stuff or your knees, it's not that good of a deal.
Yeah, well, I think most of the responsibility here lies on the consumer, because they need to purchase the right bike or first of all get bike fit, and then use that as an informed choice to get a bike. And then, but the industry will push most people onto something that they're not capable of riding. And I think most geometries of bikes are too extreme for most people who maybe sit at a desk day to day and don't practice cycling enough. And then when they go and do it on the weekends, they're not comfortable, or they can't produce the power after a 4-hour ride. And then the industry's answer seems to be like, oh, we've increased the tire clearance so you can drop the pressure. And it's like sticking a Band-Aid or a plaster on like an open wound from a gunshot or something. It's just like completely the wrong way to address the problem. Like, you need to sort out the geometry first, and then think about like the force inputs going into the rider. And then just saying, I'll put a bigger tire on it and dropping the pressure is just shows you how badly educated those people are, because the tire is responsible for like grip, rolling resistance, suspension, and damping. They're asking it to do 4 things. And then by adjusting one of those things, so if you want to adjust the suspension or the comfort, you do directly adjust the rolling resistance, or you adjust the grip, or you adjust the way the tire rolls in the corner. So you adjust the feel of the bike. And it's like, you can't ask one thing to do 4 jobs. At some point, you have to take one of those jobs out of the tire, put it into another component so you can like balance it. And we saw maybe a couple of years ago when the bikes started having suspension at Paris-Roubaix, like very small elastomer suspension systems. And I actually thought that's quite a positive step, but it wasn't really explored enough. It didn't look good for the traditionalists, so they didn't like it. You can't be too elaborate, otherwise the UCI won't allow it. And then now we're just back at riding really, really stiff bikes again, like with tires at slightly lower pressure. And the weight of the tire goes up, the inertia of the tire goes up. The damping is an inherent quality of the rubber. You can't adjust that. By adjusting the pressure, you adjust the damping as well. So it's really bad method to just change the tire and say, oh, you can have like this aero bike, but you'll be comfortable because you can fit a 30mm tire. It's just not. It's not the right way of doing it.
You're trying to optimize on a very short amount of possibilities, like on 5%. You're trying to get the most out of.
Yeah, exactly.
At the beginning of the interview, you mentioned that bikes are not accessible that much as they were previously. And I got, in probably one of our last episodes, the critique that, okay, we were harping on this problem, but you as an engineer, what would you change, or how would you make bikes more accessible? How would you build up a road bike that would be more accessible and more cheaper to people to start biking?
So if we're still talking about profit-making companies,
yeah.
So let's say, okay, so you still want to make a profit, you're not a charity, then to make a cheap product for the consumer, you need to make a volume product, right? So you need to make lots. Everyone knows that. So the current method of carbon bike frames and the supply chain doesn't suit itself well to making lots of one product. First of all, for a carbon frame, you need 4 or 5 different huge steel molds, which are very costly for the brand to purchase. The price of the bike then needs to be elevated as such that they can pay for the molds by selling a certain number of bikes. They have to have a double extra small and an extra large. Not many people are going to buy those, but the mold still costs the same. So overall, the price of the carbon bike goes up. The price of the carbon bike still goes up because it's a very man-made product. Everything is, I mean, you get companies now like Giant, which are saying they're using robotic arms to lay up the carbon in the mold. Frankly, I think that's a bit marketing-y. Like, they're still majority hand laid up. So the carbon pieces are cut out with a laser cutter or a CNC cutter, but they're still laid in by hand. They're put into the mold by hand. They're cured, which is maybe a 4-hour process. They're then demolded by hand. You need a couple of guys to lift the mold out of the oven. It's very heavy. It's quite dangerous. And then there's a lot of finishing that goes on with most carbon frames. So like sanding and finishing and looking for defects before even you get to the painting stage. I would say, like, estimate it's like probably a 24 man-hour process, which pushes the price up. And then the monetary risk of having a QC reject then is quite bad, because you've wasted 24 hours of man-hour, even though the brands are pushing bottom dollar for, labor costs because they're outsourcing it to Far East. And obviously they want their margin on top of that. So that's why bikes are expensive. And it's still really high-end road cycling. Okay, bikes are everywhere in the world, whether you look at like Delhi, Amsterdam, London, everywhere has bikes. But top-end road bikes is still very niche. So that's why they're expensive. And like we said before, there's not been many advancements in the method of production of carbon. It's still quite labor-intensive. So what I would like to see is more brands pushing aluminium bikes. I think 95% of people wouldn't benefit from a carbon bike versus an aluminium bike with good geometry. Unfortunately, the big brands won't like doing this because it's not aluminium is not sexy. Right? Carbon fiber has so many like high-end connotations, whether it's like Formula One cars, Lamborghinis, or like racing yachts. You hear carbon fiber everywhere. You even get like carbon fiber jewelry, like male jewelry or something if you want it. It's a very like elevated material, and it's essentially just plastic with carbon strands in it. But I don't know which brand is going to say, okay, we're going to mass produce a lot more aluminium frames, because with an aluminium frame you don't need an expensive steel mold to produce it. You need basically a quite basic welding jig, which brings the cost down a lot more. We know that aluminium frames like Cannondale's CAD 10 and the CAD 8 before that prove that aluminium frames can be very light and very stiff, because most of the stiffness in a bicycle frame comes from the tube section and the diameter of the tubes, not the material. So when you lay up carbon fiber, you can't take the pure tensile modulus of the 0-degree fibers, because first of all it's mixed with resin, which kind of dilutes the stiffness, and then you lay it up in different directions to get multi-directional stiffness, which dilutes the overall tensile stiffness even further. And then if you do the calculation, I actually have a video on this, like you can maybe put the link in description, but you'll see that the overall stiffness of a carbon tube in terms of pure like tensile modulus can sometimes only be about 20 to 30% higher than an aluminium tube. So you're not getting this like double stiffness tube. Yes, it might be a bit lighter, but stiffness wise, majority of the stiffness of a bike frame or its tubes comes from how big the tube diameter is, and you can make very big sections in aluminium, which is why Cannondale's aluminium bikes can be very stiff and cheaper to make. I think they look good, but the marketing doesn't like them so much because it would be seen as a backward step, and people just want carbon fiber. So it's kind of like the consumer are pushing the carbon, and the marketing is pushing the carbon, and I don't think there's a very feasible way in the near future of making them a lot cheaper.
But this
if you see what I mean.
This is also saying that the development of the sport side of cycling is very limited with this approach.
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, you'll always have your pro teams riding the lightest and the stiffest bike, and that will always drive people to want carbon bikes. But for 95% of people, they won't benefit from having a carbon bike. The weight gain, or the weight savings of a carbon bike, if you do the physics, like upper climb, it's hardly anything. It's more important to have a good geometry and a good bike fit. And I'll bang on about bike fit and geometry, but it really is the most important thing. Body position, how aero you are, how comfortable it is to put your power out in an aero position. If you can do that well on an aluminium bike, you'll be far faster than anyone on a carbon bike. One of my best mates here, who I race with, he wins most of the races he enters with us, and he rides an aluminium bike just because he's got more power and he's got a good bike fit, and that's the way it is. But it's just not very sexy to market aluminium, I don't think.
But wouldn't an aluminium bike, from the properties of the material, be more too stiff, like rigid, and on the longevity side, that for a 200-kilometer ride, it wouldn't be that good of a deal in comparison to a carbon bike?
I think that's a very easy excuse for the industry to make, to say that aluminium bikes are stiff, and I think it's very naive to say that, because the inverse of stiffness is flexibility. And like I said before, the most of the stiffness in a bike frame comes from its tube diameter.
Okay.
So you can make it more flexible if you change the diameter or change the what's called second moment of area of the tube, which is how resistant it is to bending. So you can make an aluminium bike which is flexible and comfortable. And at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if it's aluminium or carbon. These materials are all elastic. So if you bend them, you'll bend. If you let go of the load, they'll return back to the original shape. I mean, carbon fiber with epoxy has a tiny, tiny, tiny bit of high frequency damping. It's very, very small, and it's actually not perfectly elastic. So if you put a load into a carbon bike, or if you put an energy input into a carbon bike, it'll actually spring back with slightly less than you put in. So, but the marketing people don't say that because it would be seen as inefficient. Whereas a metal frame, whether it be titanium, steel, or aluminium, is more perfectly elastic. So whatever flex you put into it will come back. So you don't need to worry about power loss or anything like that. And you can manipulate the tube shapes to give deflection, whether that be the seat post or the seat stays or whatever. So the only thing, really limiting aluminium is there could be an issue with fatigue. So aluminium doesn't have the best fatigue life, particularly after it's been welded. It gets heat affected and it can crack. But I mean, we're talking, for most people's use of a bicycle, we're talking like 20 years or something like that, probably. If you're a heavyweight pro riding it day in, day out, then yeah, you might see issues after a couple of seasons. But for most people, the fatigue life is not really an issue, because at the end of the day, every mass-produced bike has to go through ISO fatigue testing to be accredited and to be sold. So they are tested, the design is tested to a fatigue limit, and it's not really an issue if you do the design right.
So you're saying that my giant ATX 870 from 2001 is probably not that best of a deal to ride today anymore, but otherwise...
The ATX, is that the full suspension one?
Nah, that was that was the rigid one. And NRS was the fully one.
I'm thinking of I think Giant had an ATX downhill bike.
Yeah, well, after that probably, but...
Oh, okay.
But I know that I bought it crashed, and the top tube was bent in, but no problem whatsoever.
Well, yeah, the other thing with the aluminium bikes is they don't mind being dropped. Carbon bikes, particularly the very high modulus. So, when the industry started saying, "Oh, weight isn't so important, aero is," and then the last 2 years they've realised that the aero bikes were too heavy. Most people didn't like the 9-kilo aero bikes, so we've come back to the weight side a little bit more. And to get the weight down of the aero bikes, the manufacturers are using higher modulus, what they call high mod fibers.
Yeah.
So whether
Unicorn
you get that
fibers.
Yeah, you get that in an S-Works, you get those in, all the kind of top tier carbon offerings. So S-Works, High Mod from Cannondale, the Giant TCR, Advanced SL. Yeah, Advanced SL. So to bring the weight down for the same, kind of stiffness, they're using high modulus fibers. Or to keep the weight the same and increase the stiffness, they use high modulus fibers. But the high modulus fibers don't like being dropped or impacted, so they're quite brittle. They don't have the same toughness as a more flexible fiber or a lower end fiber. So if you drop them, or a friend of mine has a special an S-Works Athos, like one of the most expensive round tube carbon bikes on the market, had a small incident the other day where he dropped the bike at the cafe. The handlebars turned around and hit the top tube. Like, just because the bike fell over in the wind and the top tube cracked all the way down the length of the top tube.
This was
Game
what
on.
I was a pro of when I was racing. Just
Game
dropping my
over.
bike.
Yeah, it was written off just from being blown over in the wind at the cafe. And that's one of the issues about the very, very lightweight high mod bikes, is that they don't like impacts. And you don't get that problem with aluminium. You can drop them, you can pretty much dent them, and you don't really harm them like that. Quite hardy.
Now that you brought it up for the end of the interview, it's like, what's your take on repairing carbon? Is it does it damage the properties any, or is it just over mystified?
I think it can be done. There's a lot of people out there who will say they're a carbon repairer and literally just sand back the paint and wrap some carbon material around it that they've bought off the internet and epoxy over it and then paint it, and then aesthetically it'll look great. But it won't be as strong as the original product, because I mean, there are methods where it can be, or it can be stronger than the original product, but you need to be very wary of something called a stress gradient, and it's getting into quite technical terms. But if you think about, let's say you've got a seat stay, which is quite a long, thin ligament of carbon. If you take that on its own, if you cut it off the bike frame, it's quite flexible. If you then have a crack in it, or even worse, like go straight through it in a crash or an impact, and then you think, oh, I'll just wrap loads of carbon around it and make it really strong. Yes, that area will be strong, but either side of that reinforcement, it will probably crack.
Get overstressed, right?
Yeah, exactly. You go from a very high strain, you go from a high strain point to a very low strain point very quickly. The gradient across that interface is very steep, and carbon doesn't like that. So you have to layer it in a way, or lay it up in a way to kind of feather that, or blend in that stiffness that you're adding from a repair patch. And I don't know many people that spend that much time considering that. And I could only think of a few carbon repairers that I would trust to do that. And yeah, it does scare me riding carbon bikes. That, you know, I love the bikes that I ride, and if I drop them, particularly the mountain bike, like is way more prone to getting cracked on if you drop it on a rock, or you crash it on a rock or something. That particularly the rear triangle is really exposed on mountain bikes. I can't believe I've broken more of them, but yeah, it's not easy to repair.
This is why carbon enduro bikes and downhill bikes never made sense for me personally, because it's just from the use point of view.
Yeah.
Just crash it.
That's it. And the other thing with carbon bikes is you can't really recycle them. They're not really recyclable. It's not worth the energy input to recycle carbon, whereas aluminium, pretty easy.
Okay, but high-end bikes, how many high-end bikes do get recycled at all? I mean,
not a lot, but at some point when...
Okay, from an ethical point of view, I get what you're saying.
Yeah, ethical point of view, at some point when everyone has one, there'll be a load of carbon bikes, and then what do you do with them? They'll just have to go in landfill.
It's just like with the electric cars and their batteries, like how can they be recycled, but not that many batteries get recycled right now, factually.
Yeah.
What would you give our listeners on the way, like a bonbon, if they are looking for a bike? Like, what crap should they cut out of all the marketing shit?
I would focus on value for money, and how well does it fit you, and how adjustable it is. I wouldn't listen to any aerodynamic claims, because 90% of the aerodynamics or the drag is your body, and nothing you do on the bike is going to change that. Like, you need to be able to adjust the bike, so having adjustable handlebars, stem height, seat post, whatever. You need to be able to adjust the bike to make your body aerodynamic and comfortable. The bike is such a small proportion of that, and a lot of things you read, if you read a popular cycling media online, it'll say, oh, one of the best things you can do to upgrade your bike is upgrade your wheels. Like your first upgrade should be upgrade your wheels. And it's probably the worst piece of advice I've ever heard, because most wheels are pretty round. There's a small bearing in the middle and they spin. There's not a lot you can do with a wheel. Okay, you can have a very deep section wheel and improved aerodynamics, but you're better off spending, honestly, like a good bike fit to get your body more aerodynamic and comfortable. And wheels is probably one of the last things I would upgrade, actually. I
Right.
would get a power meter if you're serious about training, or even logging, like even if you're just a recreational cyclist who wants to lose weight, get a heart rate monitor or a power meter and actually do your calories in, do your calories out per day. Be in a deficit and you'll lose weight. Don't buy carbon wheels. Yeah, power meter, bike fit, make it look nice, because I think psychologically you've got to like the look of it, otherwise you won't ride it. If the weather's shit and you're like, oh, I don't want to ride that piece of shit, you won't go outside.
Custom painting for all, I mean.
Yeah, yeah, buy some good kit. So you're if you're just getting into cycling, like, it is a bit weird putting on skin tight clothing. Get some good kit. You look in the mirror and you think, yeah, I look sharp. You go out and ride that. You're not going to want to go out if you look like an idiot or a noob. So yeah, invest things that are going to make you look good and lose weight and get fit. Yeah, that's what I'd say.
Okay. Where can our listeners, viewers, I mix up the things, but whatever, find you on the internet?
Yeah,
Where can they
exactly.
find you?
Top priority. Peak Talk YouTube channel. Easy.
Oh, not that I haven't mentioned it like 30 times. Yeah.
Yeah. If you just type Peak Talk into Google, it should come up.
Beside of the hairdressing channel.
Yeah. Yeah, don't go there. You'll get in all sorts of trouble.
Okay. Thanks a lot for the conversation.
Okay, cool. Hope your viewers found it interesting.
I guess so. At least
Not too
I was
boring.
I was entertained, so that's at least
I hope we
what counts.
finished on a positive note there. Not going on too much negative stuff about engineering.
No, the clothing part was pretty interesting for me.
Okay, yeah. Good.
Okay. So thanks a lot and
Cool.
goodbye.
Cool.
Bye.
Cheers. Bye.